Today, our annual parliamentary hearing is a joint event by the Interparliamentary Union and the UN, represented by the President of the General Assembly. The event, held for the first time virtually due to the pandemic, is part of a broader project to make parliaments more relevant in international democracy. And the hearing will contribute to a political declaration on corruption at the UN General Assembly in June. And the political declaration is already being negotiated by the Conference of the Parties of that convention, supported by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. It's obviously a subject that is of great concern. I'm delighted to say that we have 400 parliamentarians registered for the meeting. And a very big thank you to those who are joining us from the Far East, because it's very late there, late into the evening. But I think that it shows the concern that you have about corruption, combating corruption, and that it really is something that permeates all levels of society.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I send my warmest greetings to this important conference on tackling corruption and the threat it poses to peace and justice. Corruption squanders public resources, undermining sustainable, inclusive development and peaceful societies. It angers people, rightly, and erodes trust in governments and their leaders. The global COVID-19 pandemic is increasing the risk of corruption from the health sector to public procurement, stimulus packages, and rescue funds. A strong recovery must include measures to prevent and combat corruption and bribery. The United Nations is providing support to governments on including such measures in their response packages based on the UN Convention Against Corruption. Today's meeting is an important chance to discuss how governments, international organizations, and civil society can work together to reinforce anti-corruption measures, contributing to a strong recovery and the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We must all do more to prevent and reduce corruption. Next year's special session of the General Assembly against corruption is an opportunity we should not miss. There is too much at stake. I send you my best wishes for productive discussions, and I thank you.
So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to ask our first speaker, the President of the UN General Assembly, Volkan Bozkır, to make his opening remarks.
Duarte Pacheco, President of the Interparliamentary Union, distinguished members of Parliament, Excellencies, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the annual parliamentary hearing at the United Nations. Before starting, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, for taking over this very important task and wish you all the best during your endeavors. This year, our substantive discussion will focus on fighting corruption to restore trust in government and improve development prospects. This is pertinent to the General Assembly's 32nd special session on corruption, which will be held in June. As a fellow parliamentarian, your crucial role at the United Nations has always been clear to me. By translating UN resolutions into effective national legislation, parliamentarians turn our multilateral dreams into realities. And the flow of information goes both ways. Through sharing their national and local experiences, parliamentarians help to inform member states of the challenges and hopes of the people we serve. Parliamentarians also play an essential role in keeping governments accountable. I thank you for all your efforts to support multilateralism here at the United Nations and in your home countries. The General Assembly adopted the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument, the UN Convention Against Corruption, in 2003. While we have come a long way since 2003, corruption remains a pervasive global challenge and continues to erode public trust and democratic institutions. SDG 16 and its targets require member states to build effective, transparent, accountable, and inclusive institutions, and reduce illicit financial flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, therefore reducing bribery and corruption. Just like corruption, the pandemic is hitting the most vulnerable, those who depend on social protection and state services the hardest. The potential impact of corruption during the pandemic cannot be overstated. It could jeopardize a state's ability to respond to and recover from this crisis. Already, corruption has led to scarcity in essential protection, life-saving equipment, adequate assistance, and the provision of vital services. Corruption has caused thousands of extra lives to be lost during this pandemic.
Something that is being negotiated in Vienna at the moment. It is about creating an international anti-corruption court or other mechanism. And the objective is to prosecute leaders who've taken bribes or who are stealing from the public purse outright, knowing that they'll most probably go unpunished because of close ties with judiciary. But first of all, let me give the floor to Justice Richard Goldstone, co-founder and board member of Integrity Initiatives International. Sir, you have 10 minutes to make your case.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As we know, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, is one of the most widely ratified international conventions, 187 parties. We know too that UNCAC requires member states to enact domestic anti-corruption laws. These include the prevention of extortion, bribery, and money laundering. The majority of member states, the states parties to UNCAC, have done so. These laws have hardly deterred grand corruption or kleptocracy, corruption at the level of the highest officials of state. The reason is not difficult to locate. UNCAC is government-driven and relies on governments to implement the convention and the laws promulgated pursuant to it. The kleptocrats are invariably in control of their own governments. UNCAC says very little about the mechanisms for enforcement of the provisions of the convention or the domestic laws that it requires. Its provisions against political corruption, not surprisingly, therefore, are weak. The consequence is that every year corruption, grand corruption, has diverted trillions of dollars from public resources such as healthcare, education, and economic opportunity, the very issues we saw highlighted in the impressive video from Transparency International. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in enormous corruption by public officials in many countries, including, unfortunately, my own. It is a sad commentary on human nature that so many women and men are prepared for their own selfish interests to deprive the victims of the pandemic of the care that they require for their very survival. Kleptocrats operate with impunity. They steal vast sums and in most cases launder the ill-gotten gains in safe havens such as Switzerland, Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and others. The conclusion, unfortunately, I would suggest, is that we must recognize that UNCAC has substantially failed to curb or deter grand corruption, kleptocracy. The criminals are protected by their control over their own criminal justice systems. They control the police and prosecuting authorities, and sometimes the courts themselves. The solution can only lie in an international mechanism with authority and power to freeze the laundered money and to investigate and punish the kleptocrats.
Walter Pacheco, President of the Interparliamentary Union, distinguished members of the Parliament, Excellencies, I trust you have held productive discussions over the past 2 days, and I'm delighted that you were able to organize such distinguished and experienced panels despite the additional challenges imposed by the pandemic. I hope the learning from this event will feed into the General Assembly special session in June.